Now, in the diplomatic fallout from the Ukraine war, there's a new alliance about to be forged between Russia and North Korea. All this week, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been in Russia. He went there by armored and by all accounts very comfortable train, and he's been holding talks with President Putin. Russia needs weapons for its war in Ukraine, something which North Korea apparently has in abundance, and North Korea needs, well, pretty much everything. We've been trying to wrap our heads around Mr. Kim's visit to Russia, and it's raised all sorts of questions. Are the leaders of Russia and North Korea about to forge a new alliance? If so, what are the implications for the West and for Africa, where Russia's military presence has been steadily increasing? Well, for more on this, I'm happy to say that I'm joined now on the line from London by the former British diplomat and former EU Managing Director for the Middle East and North Africa, Professor Nicholas Westcott, who until recently was the director of the Royal African Society and is currently a professor of practice in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the School of African and Oriental Studies in London. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Help us get a better sense of how significant this trip has been.
This was an extraordinary and I think meaningful meeting between the leaders of two of the most authoritarian governments in the world, and increasingly isolated countries. It was on the surface mainly about guns and rockets. We know President Kim of North Korea has an obsession with rockets. He has devoted a huge amount of his national wealth to it. And the Russians have a great deal of rather more advanced rocket technology that he would love to get his hands on. And President Putin, we know, is running short of ammunition, and it's believed the North Koreans have a lot of it going spare that he could usefully use in his war in Ukraine. So there was mutual interest in this meeting. But it was still extraordinary and significant for two reasons. It was an obvious attempt by Putin to demonstrate to the UN Security Council that he does not care what they say. He was quite willing to breach UN Security Council agreed sanctions against North Korea to demonstrate that they would increase their trade with each other. He appeared willing to share forbidden technology with North Korea and was effectively saying to the Security Council, I don't care. And that is significant. Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, feels no longer bound by its actions and is unlikely to be willing to allow it to act effectively in a whole range of conflict areas. And secondly, though, it is, the US described it as an act of desperation. It does suggest that President Putin has fewer friends to turn to help him in his war. And President Kim of North Korea is not somebody you turn to lightly. So it was quite a very interesting meeting in that sense. A worrying one, certainly, and come in a minute to what it might mean for Africa. But for the world as a whole, it's a discouraging development.
Well, I mean, thanks for putting it very clearly there. But discouraging, yes. But is it a meeting that'll make most Western politicians shudder?
No, because the difference that North Korea could make to the war in Ukraine remains marginal. Nevertheless, they will be watching with anxiety because, if you like, it illustrates that President Putin will stop at nothing to prosecute his war in Ukraine. And that's to some extent already clear, but he is, again, demonstrating that he is going to use every last ally, every last old weapon that he can lay his hands on to continue to prosecute the war. So to that extent, discouraging. I think it will steel determination of those countries who wish to uphold the freedom of Ukraine. So they're going to have to persevere with this because unless they do, Russia will just exhaust everybody until they get their way, which would be a bad thing for all of Europe and much of the rest of the world.
And looking at it from an African perspective, Professor Westcott, and bearing in mind Russia's increasing presence in Africa, I mean, we heard both the North Korean leader and the Russian president saying the two countries had the shared aim of fighting imperialism across the world. I mean, what should we in Africa read into this Russian-North Korean alliance?
Yeah, there's no immediate impact on Africa. They don't appear to have agreed any specific actions in that area. But there are two areas of this new alliance, this meeting, that will have an impact. Firstly, it will, if anything, prolong the war in Ukraine, and therefore the knock-on effects in terms of pressure on the world food supply, oil prices, global inflation, and the whole disruptive effect to the world economy of the conflict in Ukraine. And that's not, in the long run, going to be a good thing for Africa at all. African leaders have already been to Moscow to say, please stop disrupting the grain trade. But secondly, it's this point you make about a solidarity front against imperialism. It shows that Russia, and I think in this respect, China also has a part in this kind of rhetoric, that they are trying to set up the world as a conflict between imperialist West and solidarity amongst the South, the global South, they like to call it. Not that Russia wishes to be lumped into the global South, but China certainly does wish to encourage solidarity amongst the global South against, they see it as a rich and imperialistic West who dominate the global system. So they're upping the ante, as we would say, on trying to divide particularly African countries into those who support China and Russia and North Korea, I guess, and those who are willing to remain part of a global economy, maintain friendly relations with Western countries, continue to do business and participate in the financial running and the global trade networks that have been the mainstay of global growth since the Second World War. They wish to overturn that order, and that would have very significant impact on Africa. But clearly there are some countries to whom the offer of unqualified support for whatever they want to do, whether they are coup leaders trampling on democracy or governments that don't wish to participate in an open global economy, they're open to this argument. And we also know that the argument has resonance on the street. And coup leaders have recently appealed to anti-imperialism, anti-French sentiment to try and give themselves some legitimacy that they don't have through any democratic or form of accountability. They say, we are here to defend our country against the imperialist West. And that they find a very useful argument, and it does have some resonance with some people on the street. It doesn't improve their way of life, their standard of living, but it gives authoritarian leaders a degree of ideological cover.
Very interesting analysis. And we know, of course, in that regard, that Russia has been making inroads into Africa, as you hinted, primarily through the Wagner mercenary group. In fact, just a few days before he died, its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, spoke about bringing freedom to Africa. What do you think his death means for Africa and for Russia's presence on the continent, presuming, of course, that Wagner has been acting on behalf of the Russian state?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because Wagner inhabited this grey area where it was not a formal part of the Russian state, but was clearly linked to its interests and was free to promote it. As you see, Prigozhin was also touting this anti-imperialist rhetoric in order to justify his presence there. Since his death, it remains unclear who now controls Wagner. And Wagner is not just troops, it's also an economic enterprise. And in the Central African Republic, in return for their protection that they provide to the government, they have received the revenues from a number of mineral concessions, gold, precious stones, that gives them a source of income. So Wagner has income as well as spending money on troops. And the troops are still there. The troops are still there in Central African Republic. They are still there in Mali. They're probably still there in Libya, as long as they weren't swept away by the Burston Dam in Derna. So Wagner is still a presence in Africa, but who it answers to, who is giving it its orders, that remains unclear. We know that Putin introduced the leaders of Central African Republic and Mali to the head of the GRU, the External Security Service, while they were in St. Petersburg for the Russia-Africa summit. And the presumption is that they have taken over control of Wagner, but there's very little clarity because a lot of the Wagner commanders had a good deal of autonomy, and it's not clear if they've got their own sources of revenue, why they would wish to hand over some of that to the Russian state. So it's unclear, but what is clear is that they're still there and they're still doing the job that Prigozhin set them up to do.
On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Professor Nicholas Westcott. As always, brilliant analysis. And Professor Westcott is a former British diplomat. Recently, he was the director of the Royal African Society. He's currently a professor of practice in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the School of African and Oriental Studies in London. Thank you very much indeed.